Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Climate Commission's Community Conversation. It's a fantastic turnout tonight. Thank you for coming out in such huge numbers here at the Canberra Playhouse Theatre. I'm Bernie Hobbs. I'm going to be chairing the discussion tonight. Absolutely rapt to be here, as you all are, with our climate commissioners to hear the updates on climate science, on what we're doing, risks and responses to the changes in the climate, and also hear your questions. That's what tonight's all about, is giving you an opportunity to engage with our climate commissioners, hear from our experts in the science, in the policy, in the industry and economics. If I seem familiar, it's probably because I used to be a judge on the New Inventors, and we seem to be having a bit of run on them tonight. There's another one over there, but tonight is not a night about television has-beens, as I said. It's about you engaging in conversation with our Climate Commission. Before we start the evening, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land. I'd also like to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and the elders from other communities who may be here tonight. I've got a few housekeeping matters. As you came in this evening, you would have been rapt to receive a bit of documentation. The just released today, hot off the press, Critical Decade 2013 Climate Change Science Risks and Responses. The far handier and more reader-friendly synopsis document attached to it, the free pen, always a big crowd pleaser, and the reason for that pen, the event feedback form. Please keep hold of that feedback form. A big part of the Commission's role is engaging with the community, not just updating you on the findings, on the latest science and responses and where we're at, but hearing from you. So the Commission wants to make sure that these kinds of events are running and delivering as best they can. So please make sure you fill that form out a little bit later on. You also would have seen some signage on the way in that said tonight's proceedings are all going to be filmed. Every event that the Commission's involved in, or the Commissioners are involved in, I should say, like this, is filmed and put on the website, so that it means that you didn't have to be here to hear the information and hear the questions answered. Because it is being filmed, if you do ask a question in the second half of the proceedings, I'll just ask you need to fill out a release form. It's a very Hollywood thing to be involved in. So after you've asked your question, the mic runners will just get you to sign a release, and that will allow your question to go onto the video. You've got your feedback forms and report. The emergency exits, you can see your green lit doors on each of the levels that we're on here tonight. And if you could pop your mobile phones on silent if you haven't already, that would be great. As I said, the aim of the evening is to begin a conversation between you and the commissioners. So my role this evening is to chair that. So for me, it's about making sure that we not only hear from the commissioners, but from as many of you as possible. So I'll give you a few tips on how we'd like to run that a little bit later, but it will be pretty much me playing the role of Tony Jones with a slightly younger haircut. That's how we'll be going tonight. First up, though, I do want to hand over to Professor Tim Flannery, the Chairman of the Climate Commission, to introduce his fellow commissioners and then to lead into the update that we'll be receiving from them. So join me, please, in welcoming Tim Flannery.
Thanks so much, Bernie, for being our MC for this evening. And thank you all for coming here for this, the 20th Community Forum the Climate Commission has run. And I might just say this is our largest audience that we've had out of those 20. So well done, very, very good. The Climate Commission was established in 2011 because the federal government felt that there was a need for an organisation which could communicate clearly to Australians on all aspects of climate change, and also to hear back from Australians about what they thought about climate change. So our mandate's a very simple one. We explain climate change science, some of the economic options that countries are taking around the world as they address climate change, and the state of play internationally, so what countries are doing. That's all we do. We don't advise government on anything. We don't suggest targets or anything like that, and we are independent of government, so we don't take advice from the minister. We run our own show within the mandate that we're given. And we've found over the years that we've been operating that there's some real strength in that approach. I should also say we don't comment on government policy, or do we comment on opposition policy, just as a courtesy to the opposition. We've found, well, it's good to treat everyone fairly and equally in this, I think. We've found that there's some real strength in the approach we've taken. Increasingly, international news agencies are carrying our stories. We find that there isn't another equivalent organisation around the world that gives objective, clear, concise information on climate change in the way that we do. So we're covered occasionally by the New York Times, by The Guardian, by a number of other news agencies around the world. We do several different things. We have community forums like this. We release reports, and the community forum this evening is really backed up by one of our major reports, what I think is our most important report to date. It's report number 27, by the way. So if you go to our website, you can gain access to a whole series of reports on all aspects of climate change, as I've described. So we have community meetings, we have reports, and our website, which is a great resource for everyone. I hope that you get a chance to go and visit it, because it really is, it's got a lot of good information on it. This evening, we have 5 of our 6 commissioners with us. We have Professor Leslie Hughes from Macquarie University, who is our expert and a world authority on adaptation to climate change, but also on biodiversity impacts. We have Professor Will Steffen from ANU, local hero here in his hometown, who's with Leslie, co-authors on this report, Will being the lead author. And Will is a real world authority on all aspects of climate change science, the global system, how climate systems work. We have Professor Veena Sahajwalla with us from the University of New South Wales, whose expertise is in engineering, particularly in recycling and efficiency in heavy industrial processes such as steel making. We talk about Veena as our solutions commissioner. She knows a lot about what we actually should be doing to reduce emissions. And we have Roger Beale here, another Canberra resident who I'm sure you all know. Not only is he extraordinarily experienced in terms of the global diplomacy and international action on climate change, but is a respected economist as well, and questions about economics can be addressed to Roger. The one commissioner that's not here is Mr. Jerry Houston, who was worked in the oil and gas sector through his entire career, ended up as CEO of BP Australasia. He represents our business voice, really, and I think in his absence we'll do our very best to answer any questions that are business related. That's about all I've got to say this evening. I just want to reinforce that this report is, we consider, an exceptionally significant one. I'm very grateful to Leslie and Will for doing such an outstanding job on the report. And I'd like to hand over now to them to do how will I say, is it a dog and pony act together to run through the main points of the report. So thank you. Over to Will.
Thanks very much, Tim. And Leslie and I are aware that we're standing between you and your questions and some of the answers. So we'll be brief, but we found it really useful to go through just some of the very basics of climate science and the risks and the opportunities. So let's just dive right in to the first slide. Whoever's running the slides. Oh, is it me? Where's the slide clicker? Ah, it's up here. Let me see. Yeah, that works. Okay, well, this is the iconic slide. It's global average air temperature since 1880 up to the present. A lot of wiggles in there, but certainly since 1960 or 1970, it's been trending upward. But scientists actually don't spend that much time looking at that one. We actually like to look at this one, and that's global ocean heat content. And there you see fewer wiggles, and again, a strong upward trend. The reason is about 90% of the extra heat actually ends up in the ocean. And for a country like Australia, this is really important because so many of us live around the ocean. And in many ways, a warming ocean affects us. Leslie will go into that. I could go on and talk about melting ice and about how plants and animals are responding to warming. There is an enormous wealth of evidence that is all consistent that tells us that the planet is warming. So the question then, obviously, why is this occurring? And most of you already know the answer. The answer, of course, is the so-called enhanced greenhouse effect. Now, this isn't anything new. The basic physics of greenhouse gases have been known for nearly 2 centuries. The first peer-reviewed published paper on it was in 1824. There's been a lot of evidence amassed since then. It's very simple. The energy that warms the surface of our planet comes from the sun, comes in as visible light, the stuff you can see out on a nice clear day, and as ultraviolet light, the stuff that you have to slap the sun cream on for. But our atmosphere is mostly transparent to these. They come straight on through, either are reflected by the surface when they hit ice, or they're absorbed by land and water. That heats up the Earth. To keep its balance, the Earth must emit energy back out to space. But it doesn't do it as light or ultraviolet. It does it as heat. And the physics of that means that the gases react differently. Not all the gases are transparent to the heat going out. The so-called greenhouse gases absorb or trap some of that heat and keep it close to the Earth's surface and warms the lower atmosphere and the surface. Think of it as a bit like a duna covering the Earth. So if you have a duna over you, it traps some of the heat that otherwise would go out, and that's why it keeps you warmer at night. Well, what we've been doing since the Industrial Revolution, but particularly since 1950, is enhancing that effect. We've been putting more and more greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide is the most important one, up into the atmosphere. So it's a no-brainer for scientists. That's going to absorb more of the heat that's going out. And now we have, of course, an energy imbalance that we have to deal with. So that means that the lower atmosphere and the Earth's surface are warming up, just as all the observations show. So it's like adding more feathers to our duna. It's going to trap more heat. I'll just show you one of the pieces of evidence that show how scientists really know this is happening. We can use some climate models to test if our physics is actually right. So this is last century. It's already happened. And that purple wiggly line is what the temperature should have done if it was only natural variability. Little changes in the incoming solar radiation, the odd volcano, and so on. So it wiggles a bit, but it's pretty steady. But now with our climate model, we can leave that in, but we can also add in the greenhouse gases. That's what the temperature should have done. Now notice it doesn't start splitting out until after 1950. That's because most of the emissions have actually occurred after the Second World War. So that's what temperature should have done with greenhouse gases plus natural variability. Now, of course, we have observations, and that's what the observations look like. So the models are pretty good at getting the basic energy balance of the Earth right. I could go on and on again. There is a massive amount of evidence that shows us that this is really the extra greenhouse gases that are causing the warming and not natural variability. Now, this would just be an ordinary scientific problem, except for the fact that it actually matters for us. And Leslie's going to tell you a bit, focusing on the ACT in the Canberra region. So over to you, Leslie.
As Will said, if climate change wasn't having any impact, it would just be the purview of a few academics sitting at their computers in their cardigans, just talking to each other. But we care about climate change because of the impacts that it's having. Canberra and its surrounds have already experienced, for example, some pretty devastating bushfires in 2003. The projections are for up to about a doubling of high-risk bushfire days by the middle of the century. And that's obviously because of warming, and also because Southeast Australia is in a long-term drying trend, and that trend is set to continue. You get your water from Cotter Dam and Googong Dam, and a drying trend affects inflows into those dams. We are already seeing quite a lot of impacts on our agricultural systems right across Australia. One of the things that's been happening is that a lot of the cool climate vineyards are actually moving to Tasmania. Tasmania is going to become an increasingly popular destination in the future because there'll be simply lots and lots of agriculture that we simply can't do where it's being done now. And then finally, the plants and animals globally are responding extremely sensitively to the sorts of climate warming that we've already seen, even though that climate warming has so far been relatively modest. Things like this corroboree frog, which is extremely endangered, hangs out in the bogs in Kosciuszko National Park. which are subject to drying and also to increased risk of fire. These are the sorts of animals which will be endangered even more in the future. And indeed our whole alpine zone, which only consists of about 0.1% of the continent, the worst case scenarios for the end of the century will be that we have no snow by then, with obvious impacts on the alpine zone. I'm just going to touch on some of those. So basically we're living in a new sort of climate now compared to what we had, say, 50 years ago. If we have a look at the first of these little, here's my thing. If we just have a look at this curve here, imagine that this curve here, this first orangey one, represents the distribution of temperatures over a single year. So in any one year we have an average temperature there, we have a few cold days and a few hot days just there, that little triangle. And then if we shift the average just a little bit, what you'll see is that a small shift in the average actually has a very big impact on the extremes of that year. So we lose our cold days, hardly any left, and instead of this little triangle of hot days, we have this band of hot days, and then we have a whole bunch of really, really hot days that we have never seen before. So what this means is that a small shift in averages means big impacts on the extremes. And we are seeing now about twice as many really hot days as we saw in the 60s. We're also seeing changing rainfall patterns. That first graph there is trends in annual total rainfall 1900 to 2012 and measured over that period. There's not a lot happening, but if we look at the more recent history, 1970 to 2012, which is that far graph, what we can see here is that the brown areas on the graph, on this map, are where it's been getting drier since the 70s. And we can see that most of the eastern part of Australia has been getting drier, as well as the southwest. The north has been getting wetter. Will talked about climate models, and most of the climate models, the observations are matching the climate models pretty closely, but in some cases the climate models are proving to be a bit too conservative. And I'll just give you one example. This is the Arctic sea ice. What we've got here on this graph is the time going back to the beginning of last century, and on this axis is 10 to the 6th, that is a million kilometres squared. So that's the amount of ice that we're measuring. This big grey purpley area is what the climate models predict would be happening to the Arctic sea ice given the global warming that we've seen and what we're predicting in the future. What we're actually seeing is this black line here. So these are the observations, and what you can see is that the Arctic sea ice is actually disappearing at a significantly faster rate than the models were predicting. So the models are pretty good. Sometimes they're not so good, but when they're not so good, they tend to be too conservative. Well,
so what do we do about this? There's often a complaint, why should Australia do anything? Nobody else is working on the problem. But the Commission published a report, I think it was almost a year ago now, the major report, showing that a lot of action's already occurring. See here, 35 countries around the world have national emissions trading schemes. China's going to trial an emission trading scheme soon that covers a couple 100 million people, and this is growing around the world. We're in the early days, so when we look at emissions in the atmosphere, they're still going up. But there's a lot of encouraging sign that countries are taking action. And indeed, the two big countries in terms of emissions, US and China, are both moving. US emissions are already trending downwards. You might not believe that from what happens in the US Congress. But President Obama and a lot of local and state jurisdictions are actually taking effective action. So things are happening. And Australia's in there too. We've started acting as well. And we're right in the middle of the countries that are taking action. Here's an example of what we're doing. This is a pretty impressive figure. In just over the last decade or so, 1 million household PV systems installed in Australia. That's actually a significant number now. And it's starting to have an effect. We start to see electricity sector emissions coming down in Australia. And that's one of the major reasons for that. And they're becoming competitive economically as well. But to really get on top of the problem, we have to take a global, long-term perspective. And the way scientists like to do it is use something called a carbon budget. And let me explain briefly how it works. You'll see something called a 2-degree limit up there. Most countries around the world, including Australia, have made it a policy target not to allow climate change to go beyond a temperature rise of 2 degrees. There's a wealth of evidence that says risks really escalate above that value. Once that policy target's in place, scientists can then actually calculate what do we need to do. So we go backwards and say, all right, how much carbon, CO2, can we actually emit and still stay within that limit, or have a reasonable chance of doing so? And the answer is 1,000 billion tons of CO2 between 2000 and 2050. And we need to be pretty much decarbonized by 2050. How are we tracking? This is 2013. So in the first 13 years, including both 2000 and 2012, we've consumed nearly 40% of the budget. So in just 13 out of 50 years, we've consumed 40% of the budget, leaving only 60% for the last 37 years. So basically, we're overspending. If that was your family budget and you were spending it too fast, then you knew you'd have to cut back before the next paycheck came in. Same thing here. So this is the challenge we face. We still have 600 billion tons we can still emit of fossil fuel-based emissions. But that's the limit. So the question now is, how do we get emissions trending downward? And how do we, in the most economically effective way and socially least disruptive way, phase this stuff out by the middle of the century? We need to make this personal, though, and this is where Leslie comes in.
I know that scientists like Will and I look at graphs like this all day, and we really like them and they mean a lot to us. But I want to try and make this particular graph a lot more personal. What this graph actually shows is two sorts of futures. So this little wiggly black line, that's the temperature we've already had going back to 1900. These are the two futures. If we really do our best to, as Will says, keep below this 2 degrees limit, this is our future here. If we keep going exactly the way we have been going, we are on a trajectory which is actually at the moment travelling along the top of that red bar there. Okay, so let's make this personal. That's just a graph. There's me. I was born in the 1960s, and that bar represents, if I live to about 85, what the mean annual temperature that I will experience over my lifetime. I have two teenage kids born in the mid-90s, and under this business as usual red scenario, that's the temperature on average that they would expect to experience over their lifetime. Now, I don't have any grandchildren yet, but if my kids have kids when they're about 30 and those kids live till they're about 85, my grandkids will live into the next century. And that's the sort of future that they would be facing under if we keep doing what we've been doing. So really, this, for the climate commissioners, and I'm sure for a lot of you, this is really the reason why we do what we do. It's not about us, it's about our future generations. And with that, I'll hand back over to Bernie. Thank you.
Will and Leslie, for those really informative and quite personal, as you said, graphics. Now, those graphics are all available on the Climate Commission website. So if you haven't already been there, climatecommission.gov.au has got heaps of fantastic infographics that really get information across in a nice, simple image. And they've also got nice video versions. If you found that summary document too long to read, they've got a 3-minute video version of the latest report as well, so everyone can leave incredibly well formed from the website there. Now we're moving into our Q&A session of the evening, and the way we're going to work that, because we want to capture your questions, as many questions as we can, we've got runners with microphones. If the people with the microphones could sway them around. We've got one up there, we've got one seated in the middle there, and we've got one up the back. We've also got two up on this tier up here as well. So I don't want you to dally, because if we've talked a little bit about doing the maths here. We've got less than an hour on average. That means we've got time for about 20 questions, and that's only if your questions are short and sharp. And I can guarantee that your answers will be short and sharp. So we want to really get through as much as we can. Now, please put your hands up if you've got a question. We want to get our microphones to you. We can start by passing that one along to there. Can you see the microphone who's in the... Yep, if you can pass it down to the woman who's about to stand up with the blonde hair. And let's keep moving with this, if we can get as many as we can. Do you have a question sir in the blue shirt? You just wanted a little bit of attention over there, didn't you? No, that's right. And we've got we've got some questions up here. We've got a question in the middle up the front there. So if we can start with you. Now, with the questions, we're not accepting comments, and we do just want a single question. If we have time at the end, when everyone has asked all their questions, then yes, we welcome second questions and comments. But please, if you could just say your name and ask your question. Thank you.
Jenny Goldie, either to Will or Tim. The other day, the International Energy Agency released a report showing, making some recommendations about how we could stay within the 2-degree guardrail, but it said without affecting economic growth. Now, could either of you comment on that and say how realistic this is, and whether you think that if we are to keep within the 2-degree guardrail, whether we actually do have to affect economic growth?
Thank you for that beautiful demonstration of a question within the time frame that was succinct and clear. Roger.
I think we have a chance of doing that. Most models have suggested that there might be a slight shading of the rate of economic growth, but that will still grow very strongly. How strongly we grow, how much the shading is, depends on how rapidly we begin to deploy new technologies and how much we can reduce the cost of those technologies. So acting earlier and making sure that new technologies are both going on the shelf and then being deployed quickly is going to enable us to grow quite strongly while we're reducing emissions.
Thank you, Roger. And we had a question up in the top middle. Yes, thanks.
Hello, my name's William Mudford. I'm a student at ANU. My question is, what do you think the role of food is and food production in curbing climate change in the near future, particularly in our ACT region?
Yes, Leslie?
Look, I can't comment on food in the ACT region, but I guess you all eat pretty much like what everybody else eats. Look, I think one of the risks of climate change is for our food security. We export about 73%, I think, of our food production. We only actually produce about 1% of the world food production, but it's an important export industry. I think as far as agriculture is concerned, we're going to have to accept that a lot of agricultural industries will have to transform, be done differently elsewhere, move in other places. But there is a lot that personally we can do in terms of what we buy and how we consume it. And I'm afraid for all the carnivores out there, and I'm a carnivore myself, one of the main things that we can do is eat less meat, because red meat in particular has a much bigger carbon footprint than either white meat and certainly than fruit and vegetables and that sort of thing. So you can actually affect your personal carbon footprint based on what you eat. And eating locally produced fresh food that's not processed and not packaged excessively is also a really fairly simple and easy way that individuals can affect their own emissions.
Thanks, Leslie. And if I can ask you, you have the next question, Madam, and if I can ask you, yes, to stand up as well so we can get a nice photo of you.
I hope it's
right now, microphone right up. Another rock and roll moment. You need to get a lot closer than you think for a microphone.
I just want to know, because I've heard a lot about methane, how this fits into the picture in relation to climate change.
Will?
Greenhouse gas. On a molecule per molecule basis, it's much more potent than CO2, but it has a much, much shorter lifetime in the atmosphere, a half-life of about 10 years, compared to very long periods, up to thousands of years for CO2. It is important. The biggest sector that produces methane is agriculture, which we've just been talking about, mainly through ruminants and through irrigation, where you have anoxic conditions when the carbon comes out of the system. So it does help to get CO2 reduced, but there's a lot of misconception that we can let the CO2 problem drift by dealing with CO2 and some of the other greenhouse gases. The problem is the very, very long lifetimes of CO2 in the atmosphere, and the fact that when methane does get up there, it ends up as CO2 when it gets oxidized. So it's important, but it's not the main player in the game.
Thank you, Will. And yes, we have a question here, and then we'll go over to the young gentleman on the edge there. And don't forget, please put your hands up so we can see you and get the microphone to you. Thank you.
Charlie Barton, a farmer from Wee Jasper. Given the past performance of societies and governments and industry in the past in trying to stick to various targets, it looks as though the 2-degree target in practice isn't going to be contained. If the Earth continues to get warmer, when do you think we're going to be forced, however reluctantly, to use some geotechnical approach to cool the Earth in order to buy some more time?
Geoengineering, Tim. Thank you.
I'd just like to first comment on the assumption you made that we haven't been very good at sticking with targets. Perhaps that's true historically if you go back a decade or so, but recently the targets that were set under the Copenhagen Accord, which apply at a national level, there's some quite encouraging information suggesting that many of the most important countries are meeting those targets. So the US, which is responsible for something like 18% of global emissions, it set itself a target to reduce its emissions below 2005 levels by 17% by 2020, and it seems to be on track to do that. It certainly had a good emissions, a good reduction over the last couple of years. Europe is, of course, on track to reach its target of 20% below 1990 levels. Australia set itself a target of at least 5% below 2000 levels, and we've seen our emissions profile flatten out and reduce very slightly over the last year, so there's at least been a temporary peak, and there's every chance that we'll reach our target as well. The Chinese have recently exceeded the targets they set themselves, and that's in terms of emissions intensity particularly. Now, admittedly, all of the pledged targets are insufficient to avoid dangerous climate change. We need to double our efforts if we're to achieve that. But there is encouraging, I just want to make the point, there is encouraging evidence that the countries are increasingly meeting their self-set targets. When we'll start seeing major impacts, that's one area perhaps I should hand over to Will and Leslie more to answer.
Yeah, well, look, one of the problems when you get above that 2-degree limit that we talked about, and I think that may be what Charlie's referring to about the need for geoengineering, is that some of the big ticket items in the climate system, we sometimes call them tipping elements, may be activated. Examples of that are the outburst of methane from the frozen soil in the far north in Siberia and so on. There's a bit of sporadic activity there now, but above 2 degrees, much above it, it looks like that may really take off. And once some of those take off, there are amplifying feedbacks that take the climate system outside of our control. It's those sort of things that make going above the 2 degrees dangerous. And I think as that becomes better known, I think there'll be more motivation to make sure we don't go into that space. But there's a whole host of direct impacts on humans. You might just mention a couple of those, Leslie, above 2 degrees.
Well, I'd like to just come back to the geoengineering question. I mean, there have been lots and lots of different schemes, some sensible, some completely wacky, put forward to geoengineer the climate. Things like putting iron filings in the ocean to boost photosynthesis of phytoplankton and draw down CO2. It does work, but it has all sorts of other effects. All the way up to putting big reflectors in space to reflect solar radiation, and then others have been suggesting that what we actually might have to do is put sulfate aerosols into the atmosphere, more acid rain of course, to once again reflect more solar radiation. Let's just hope we don't get to that point. I don't think there's any geoengineering solutions yet proposed that firstly work and that we know will have a big enough impact without some sort of collateral damage.
Thanks very much to the three of you. And over here, thank you.
Simon Shaky, I just had a quick question. Will, you mentioned solar PV. We've also seen some great economics recently released on the cost of wind power getting cheaper and cheaper. I wonder if the panel could comment on the rest of the renewable resources that we have access to and where they're up to on the development cycle.
Sure, maybe. I'll have a word, and Roger, you may want to follow up. But Look, in terms of solar, the decline in costs has been astonishing, largely driven by large-scale manufacture in China. We've seen a 75% decrease in the cost of manufacturing solar panels. So what, in the last 4 years. So what $10,000 would buy you 4 years ago, you can get for $2,500 today. That is a ferocious decline. And solar is cost competitive, broadly cost competitive at the household level now across Australia compared with conventional energy in many areas. So that's a big benefit. Wind, of course, is getting cheaper for the same reason. The Chinese are making their wind turbines, and the Indians at scale now. And there's new technologies such as gearless wind turbines that have come in that have made a difference in that area as well. There's a number of technologies higher up the cost curve, and they include like a concentrated PV or some PV with some sort of storage capacity in it. Those costs are coming down, but they're nowhere near the maturity of PV, conventional PV and wind. Likewise, wave and geothermal energy. I remember I bought shares in geodynamics some years ago at about $1.60, and they're worth 6 cents today, which tells you a little bit about how immature the technology was. But nevertheless, in coming decades, we hope to see those sorts of technologies also mature and become more cost effective.
I'll simply add that this is one of the advantages of acting and acting soon. You not only develop confidence among nations by acting, you actually also push down or push forward the learning curve on these new technologies, and that's enormously important as well. If there's a big gap that I'd love to see filled inexpensively, it's the storage of renewable power, because while some of the individual renewable powers are becoming, sources are becoming extremely competitive as their levelised production cost, the network costs are still relatively high because of the variability of these sources and the need to have backup alternatives.
Thank you. And we have a question just here, and then, yes, sir, after, yes, thank you.
Hi there. So in the absence of a strong, effective policy on climate change in the coming years, and if climate change reaches the 2-degree level, is there any chance of climate mitigation then with another policy, or is adaptation the only solution?
Start with that. I think Will said some very important things earlier, that the longer you leave this, the higher the temperature gets, the greater the chance of something like a methane clathrate meltdown or change in oceanic circulation carrying the system beyond our control. So after that point, no matter what you do, you don't have an impact. So that's important to bear in mind. Those risks increase as we delay action. But there is signs. Again, I just return. There is signs of action on this. I've recently been in China talking to our counterparts over there and doing other things, and there's clearly a move now towards a relationship with the US. And between China and the US, that's about 40% of global emissions. So if we do get a bilateral agreement in that area to act, and we may even hear something as soon as next month about that, that will drive change across the globe. So I wouldn't give up on international action. I think that there's a lot happening in that space. And I must say, although the fruits aren't there yet, we see year by year the emissions continue to grow. I'm pretty optimistic that we're getting the basic building blocks in place for strong action in future, and just hope it comes soon enough.
Thank you. And we're going up there, and then I'll keep your hands up so I can see where you are. Thanks. Yes, sir.
Byron Fay here. My question's for Will. Often the Australian newspaper reports as fact that in the last 10 years, global temperatures have been decreasing or stabilised, and that seems to be contrary to what the evidence you guys went through before. Would you be able to speak to that
Sure.
sort of misinformation?
Yeah, and there's a lot of good background on that in detail in the report. But when you saw that very first graph I put up, that temperature graph, there are a lot of ups and downs underpinned by a very long-term upward trend. It's not at all unexpected that air temperature would plateau for a decade or two embedded in a long upward trend. A couple of reasons for that. One is only 3% of the energy goes into the air, and it's whipsawed by what happens to the ocean. Good example. El Nino years globally are warmer than average. La Nina years are cooler than average. When you look at this last decade, this so-called plateau, and you simply adjust for that, you get the long-term upward trend appearing quite clearly. So it's simply being masked by patterns of vulnerability that we already know. So very simple answer, totally expected, totally explainable. The planet is still warming. The air, in fact, is still warming in terms of the long-term trend.
Thank you. And we're just going to keep on a roll here. We have a young woman here, well, a pretty young woman, sorry, and then over there. Thank you.
So my question is that there seems to be a disparity between the direct observations, satellite observations, and the IPCC climate models, and that the IPCC climate models seem to have overestimated the rise in temperature compared with direct observations. I'm talking about Roy Spencer's work, which looks at 73 different models, all of which have overestimated the increase in temperature.
So response to that?
That's exactly the issue we just talked about. It's because of this plateau. Climate models aren't very good at the short-term variability, okay, like ENSO. That can't be simulated very well. That's why the UK Met Office model isn't very good on a 5-year time frame. They're much better at the longer time frames when the fundamental change in the energy balance is the most important factor. So I think you'll see, if you look another 20 years down the track, when the temperature finishes the plateau and shoots up again, and remember, it goes through periods of plateaus, periods of sharp increase, periods of slower increase, and so on. That's just the natural variability putting its imprint on a long-term trend. When you see that, and when you saw that whole 20th century trend, you saw the climate models were pretty good. And you'll see the same thing for the 21st century. You just got to have a long enough time frame.
Thanks, Will. And I believe we have a Senator Bill Heffernan.
Oh, no,
a
a
question.
worn-out farmer from Junee. If by 2050, barring a human catastrophe, there are 9 billion people on the planet, if by 2070 there are 12 billion, and if, as the CSIRO predicts, 50% of the global protein task by 2050 will be farmed fish, and we commercialise the algae technology, which is the science is complete on for carbon emissions from coal-fired power stations, and we develop commercially thorium, what will that do to the global debate on climate change?
Could I just begin? I'm sorry I didn't acknowledge you, Senator Evan, at the beginning of the event. I didn't realise you were there. But look, they're really interesting questions that you ask. I mean, the population issue and food security, they're clearly major issues for the globe. The UN projections on population growth is that we'll reach something like 9 billion people by the end of the century, maybe 9.5 billion. But there are broad error bars around that. It may be, as you say, 12 billion, it may be 8 billion. But even at 9.5 billion, given a changing climate, food security is going to be a major issue. And I think Leslie can probably talk about the global food production impacts from climate change. Nuclear reactors, thorium and those sort of things, they are one potential emissions-free source of power. But I'd have to say, when I look at the world energy mix now, we're seeing less nuclear, with Germany now and Japan both moving away from nuclear power, but a very rapid increase in renewable energy. So we've seen, for example, in China, 49,000 megawatts of wind and solar being deployed this year, just in 1 year in China. That's enough to power pretty much the Australian economy, satisfy our energy needs. In future, we may see an increase in nuclear power. Certainly countries like China are continuing to build new nuclear power plants. But just judging from the present, I'd say it's more likely that renewables are going to get the emphasis, partly for reasons of investment. I mean, you don't need to invest $10 billion to build a wind farm. You know, you can do it incrementally at $1 million a tower, and PV likewise, you do it on a household basis. Capital raising for nuclear, unless you're in a command economy like China, I think is getting increasingly difficult. But again, Roger may have something to say about that.
Senator, I'd say that I wouldn't exclude any of those options. They should all be available globally, with people locally making their choices as to which they will deploy. But I, like Tim, have spent quite a bit of time in China. And one of the constraints on their ambitions in nuclear is that it takes a lot longer to develop the skilled workforce, and they're particularly concerned about the skilled regulatory workforce. So I think we will see probably more nuclear and ideally more thorium, but a lot more renewables, and we will have to look for new food production technologies and possibly areas to meet our role in global food security. I don't personally think that food security within Australia is going to be a major issue. It's a global issue.
Thanks, Roger. And we'll just go to the gentleman in the striped shirt up here. Thanks. We'll just ask you to state your name, and hopefully the mic will be, it should have already been on.
Here we go, Evan Turner. Just following on from what you've just been saying, wind and solar is great, but it's variable in its output. What do you guys think is the best option for Australia to create a reliable, renewable baseload?
Well, look, I think I'm right in saying that there's no silver bullet to this. But if you look at the Australian energy market and ask the question, as has been done recently by CSIRO and ANEMO, how much more variable energy can we put in from solar and wind? The answer is quite a lot. It used to be, the convention used to be that once you get to 20%, you start having difficulties. Well, Germany has shown that isn't the case. If you've got the right sort of grid with some demand management, you can go above that. I think it's fair to say that no one really knows what the limits are as yet. There are some theoretical limits, but they're way above where we are now. So for the next, out to 2020, I don't think anyone has any fears about grid stability and whatever from continuing to put renewables in place. Hopefully by then we'll have some renewables with storage, so some of the large-scale solar arrays with some storage capacity as well. But that is yet to be developed at scale in Australia.
Well, I'd simply say that even with renewables, you can balance your risks by having different geographic areas and a different mix of renewables. But it gets more expensive because you've got more capital investment to maintain system stability. Storage is going to be critical, and we should really stick to the idea of having a competitive energy market with a good mix.
Thanks, Roger. Now, just so you know, we're going to you next, and then to you, sir, and then to you, sir. So, over there. We're going great for time, by the way. We're just over halfway through questions, so please keep them coming. Keep your hands up so we get the mic to you. And don't forget, if you don't get a chance to ask your question in person, our commissioners will be sticking around for a cuppa afterwards, so you've got time to grab them then. And perhaps if you want to ask a second question, that's the time to do it. Yep, thank you.
Sarah Vancier here. I just want to mention the elephant in the room. What does the panel think about coal mining and coal exports, which are due to double soon? This will mean that Australia will be responsible for 30% of the world's emissions.
Cole?
Look, I think our latest report deals with that pretty well. We look at it from a global perspective, and I put that 600 billion tonne budget that we have left from now till 2050. Two things you can use that as a baseline to compare with. One are the Australian reserves. The Australian reserves are about 51 billion tonnes of fossil fuels, most of which is coal. That's about 8%, is it? It's 1/12. That's about 1/12 of the allowable budget. So that gives a feel for how much the Australian reserves are in the big scheme of things. If you look globally at coal, oil, gas, and non-conventional fossil fuels, which have been discovered in the last 5-10 years, you come up with a number close to 3,000 billion tonnes, about 5 times the allowable budget, sorry. So basically we have 5 times more fossil fuel than we can actually burn to stay within that 2-degree limit. That's the simple maths. So the really difficult question is, which fossil fuels and from where should we burn to get the maximum benefit from that as we transition to a carbon-free world. And that's a difficult economic, political, and social question. The science simply looks at global totals and tells you what the limits are compared to how much is actually there.
Could I just add to that, Will? There's no easy outs to this either. The report also makes it clear that planting trees and so forth is you can't substitute that for reducing burning of fossil fuels because the carbon gets into the system and eventually will work its way out. Carbon capture and storage, even if you look at very generous estimates of that, that might give us 10 or 15% more of the budget. But when we're chewing through the budget at the rate that we currently are, that doesn't translate into a large number of years. If you reduce methane, on-farm methane use, you might get an extra few years as well. But there seems to be no real, I mean, our budget is pretty fixed. It's very difficult to expand it out greatly.
And one other point I'd make is that Australia has a competitive energy resource sector. This is a global position that we've described. It's important that Australia has an opportunity in markets to supply energy that has a low environmental footprint. Otherwise, that we have the opportunity to do that within the market. But for those investing in fossil fuels, just be aware of the science and think through the longer-term risks as you make those investments.
Thanks, Roger. Maybe you should have taken some investment advice from Roger all those years ago, Tim, but those days have passed. Yes, sir.
Hi, Paul Oberhoff, public servant and Paul Oberhoff, public servant and climate student at the ANU. I like the information provided in regards to personalising climate change in terms of temperature rise. And in Australia, there's, we all know about sea level rise and also, for example, impacts on agriculture. But I'm thinking that perhaps the awareness, which I think is fairly low, just sort of a basic, I know climate change is going to happen. I think that to raise awareness, there needs to be more effort at, and I'd like to hear what the Commission thinks in regards to personalising it further, for example, impacts on industries, and I mean beyond agriculture to, for example, urban industries.
Thank you.
I'm happy to take that question. I mean, when you talk about industries, there's no question that industries are going to have to play an increasingly important role as new technologies develop. So it's a question of how you then position yourself to take on new developments in terms of science and technology. And I think there's no question that there are industries worldwide that want to take on new opportunities, and you can look at examples around in Australia where there are opportunities being taken up by industries just looking towards what the future is going to look like. Because we all do appreciate that it's going to be a resource-constrained future. I mean, it's not as if all kinds of resources are infinitely available. So I think it's also about being very clever and strategic. So it should be seen from the context of climate, but also equally importantly from the context of maintaining a competitive advantage. Because again, if we are going to be in a global market, it's no point sort of not keeping up with new technological developments and advances. And I think that's the important message that businesses are taking on and listening to what new scientific advances are happening. So I think it's probably fair to say, yes, there is a lot more we can do, but that's certainly the way. I mean, businesses are moving forward and looking at adopting and taking on new technologies to lower their resource consumption and lower energy consumption. So that's already happening.
Thanks, Veena. And we'll go to you, sir, and then up the back. And if I can just get everyone with the microphone to put their hands back up. It's kind of hard to keep track of where we are. 1, 2, 3 up the back, and we've got one up there. Yep, good, got you. You, sir, and then up the back. Thank you.
Peter Bobroff, just a concerned citizen.
I will not have you say just an Australian citizen.
Well, just. Am I to interpret what you've written and what you've said as a prospectus to the world? You're asking the world to subscribe trillions of dollars to your vision of the future. Are you prepared to stand by a prospectus like company promoters do? Are you prepared to go to jail for omission and exaggeration if that were the case?
I think that's a very succinct question. We've got the two authors of this report right here, Will and Leslie.
Look, I think first of all, we're not giving advice or recommendations or really a prospectus. What we're trying to do is put out the best scientific understanding of the issue that's in front of us. All right? So, as I said before, the science is pretty clear on a couple of things. The Earth as a whole is warming. There's no doubt about that. Evidence is unequivocal. Point number 2, it's beyond reasonable doubt that it's primarily the emission of greenhouse gases that's causing that. Happy to stand behind that, no problems with that. And as Leslie can tell you, there's really growing evidence that there are a lot of risks associated with this. We already see it. We see it in changes in extreme events and so on. So I think that part's pretty clear. And I think a lot of governments get that. That is why they have signed up to the 2-degree limit, because they understand all of that. That science has been known for a couple of decades. And in the scientific literature, it hasn't been disputed. So once you get to that point, then I think the additional thing we've done in this report is to say, over the last 5 years or so, we've been able to calculate in a probabilistic way what it would take to meet that policy target, the 2-degree target, okay? Now that's based on our understanding of how sensitive the climate is to carbon dioxide and so on, and there are some uncertainties around that. That's why it's a probabilistic target. So when I use words for the general public like a reasonable chance or a decent chance, I'm talking about a 75% probability based on our best understanding, rather than a coin toss. Once you do that, then the math becomes really simple. And I've just gone through it in one of the previous questions. So I'm quite willing to stand behind that. That's absolutely the best understanding we have now. And in fact, when you look around a lot of different scientific problems, having 97 or 98% of scientists in a contentious field agree is about as close as you're ever going to get to a real consensus. So yeah, I stand behind it.
To a miracle.
I stand behind it.
Leslie, do you also stand behind it?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, Will and I didn't make up any of the numbers in the report. All of the numbers that we cite are quoted from published peer-reviewed literature. So, for example, keeping 80% of the fossil fuel emissions, fossil fuel in the ground and not burning it, comes from, international agencies like the International Energy Agency. So, I mean, what this report does is actually just bringing together a lot of peer-reviewed, published literature in a hopefully digestible form.
Thank you. Now, we've got some people who've been holding the microphone for a long time. Right up the back, sir.
Hi, just a...
Oh. Next to him, sorry.
Just a really practical question. What do you think are the top 3 most influential things that the average citizen could do to impact this issue?
Well, that's a question that we're asked at almost every forum, some variation on that question. And I think it's probably only fair that each of the commissioners has a brief say on that, because we've all got a different perspective on it.
Maybe one each instead of 3.
So perhaps we could start, at the far end, Roger, if you...
Okay. Well, look, as somebody who worked in government for 40 years, and I'm sure Senator Heffernan would agree with this, community sentiment is enormously important to encouraging governments to act and giving them the licence to do so. So I think collective solutions are very important, and one of the important things is to make sure that your members of parliament know how you feel about the issue.
Well, certainly at the local level, I mean, if you are involved in local community activities, it's very important to sort of take that collective sort of thinking and seeing how clear-cut sort of ideas can be implemented. So whether it's something as basic as making decisions about, well, the next sort of pot of money at the local council is going to be spent on investing in solar PV, for example, at the local buildings, for instance, at local schools, shopping centres and what have you. The idea is there are well-established technologies and solutions available. It's a question of the group making a decision, and I think it's important then that collective voice is heard and actually then it's implemented at the local level. So certainly that local action is extremely important.
And to follow directly on to that, I think it's really easy sometimes as an individual to be quite despairing about the future. It can be a pretty depressing prospect thinking forward, and you shouldn't feel alone. There are enormous numbers of very active community groups to join. You know, I know here in the ACT, there's a group called Sea Change, there's the Australian Youth Climate Coalition, and just on that point, Amanda, sitting down in our front row, who's our communications advisor, was instrumental in starting that group. with just a handful of people, and there's now about 80,000 members who are really active. So I think one of the main things you can do is not sit at home and get depressed on your own, but go out and join like-minded people.
Yeah, look, there's a lot to be said for acting locally, even when you're an academic. You know, academics are sort of thought to be way up in the air and never do anything practical. But one of the things we did at the ANU, at the Fenner School, was to build a new building for a growing and quite interesting school there. But it's 6 Green Star and it's carbon neutral. And it was delivered on time and on a very stringent budget. It took a lot of effort by a lot of people who put their expertise in to do something new. And there it is on the ground operating. We can start replicating that. Again, starting locally, talking about it, telling others about it. That's how change actually really occurs.
Have you had time to think of something, Tim?
Yeah. I mean, there's no doubt that what the commissioners have said is right, that, you know, collective action's important, whether it be at the political level or at the local level, as Will says. But there's also things that individuals can do. And, you know, when I look back, you know, last month and think that, you know, last month the millionth solar installation went onto an Australian home. That is a massive achievement. If you look at the government projections of how much solar we'd have by 2030, we reached that target this year, yeah, because of individual people making a common sense decision to put solar panels on their roof. Many of those who do so are in lower incomes or on fixed incomes. It just makes economic sense to do it. So there's probably a whole lot of things you can do in terms of just energy efficiency, saving energy, or investing in your own energy systems that are really worth doing. And just add that as an individual level option.
Thank you. And I'm sorry you've been waiting so very long there.
I'm Carly Winkler. I'm studying science communication at ANU. I'm interested to know how successful you think we've been in communicating climate science, shaping the public discussion, and what kind of lessons we can learn from that to take forward into the future to make sure this science is understood.
Of course, we've been immensely successful. No, look, it's a constant battle because this is a highly contested area. There are vested interests and others who want to protect their patch, and the science is complex and it is difficult to get the word through. But I must say, I think after a couple of years of working together, the Climate Commission, with industry groups and with people in the Defence Forces and in business and whatever else, in the medical sector, we are getting better at getting that message through. And I really think that the Commission has a good model now for doing that.
Can I add something to that just occurred this morning? So this morning in Sydney we launched this latest Critical Decade report, and we had a press conference that was a little bit different from our usual one where we get up and talk. We had 4 other people there talking. We had Admiral Chris Barry, former head of the Defence Forces. We had Cassandra Rowley, I think last name was, Rowley, who's the head of ACOS. We had Brian Owler, who was the head of the AMA in New South Wales, and we had Simon McKeon, former Australian of the Year, head of the Macquarie Group, representing the business community. And each one of them spoke to the report and to how they perceive climate change as affecting their sector. So I think part of the science communication is actually to have a multitude of other voices. You know, climate change is not just about polar bears on shrinking ice floes. It's an economic problem, it's a social problem, it's a health problem, and we have to join with other people all through the community in all sorts of different sectors to get that message across, not just rely on scientists.
Thanks, Leslie. And sir, yes?
Hi, my name's Florian Benz. I, like a lot of people, am quite concerned about my personal impact on the environment. On the other hand, I love travelling abroad, so it's a big problem for me. As we all know, that flying is obviously terrible in terms of carbon emissions. When I go to book a flight, I have the option of offsetting the carbon emissions by paying a few dollars extra. I'm curious, how effective are carbon offsetting schemes, really?
Thank you. Carbon offset?
Yeah, look, my view in the long term is they're not very effective for the reason of the basic science of the carbon cycle. Basically, offsets that are based on biological systems are trying to substitute for the introduction of new carbon that had been stored away for millions of years from the atmosphere, ocean, land system, shoving that into the active system, and then putting it a little bit back but only into the active system, not back under the ground where it came from. So I think the long-term solution to things like aviation are to develop carbon-neutral fuels for aviation. There's an active research area. British Airways is running one of their 777s on the waste of London, for example. So there's some really innovative stuff being done already. The leading airlines know that their days are numbered. They know they've got to get away from fossil fuels. Offsetting programs, I think, may make you feel a little bit better, but the longer-term solution is really innovative types of air travel, innovative types of fuels, and so on. That's what's going to get us there.
Great. Thanks, Will. And we'll just leave it at that for now. Yes, sir?
Albert White. Is carbon sequestration a magical taxpayer-funded exercise in futility, which gives an illusion that increasing levels of CO2 are eminently manageable and easily disposed of? And are there geological and sociological problems involved with this particular process?
Thank you. Geosequestration. Everyone's pointing at you, Will. Sorry. However, let's hear from the economist.
Was that geosequestration or both geo?
Yeah,
okay.
Geosequestration.
Yeah, look, in principle, that's actually what you want to do. Whether it's actually going to work is another issue. Because, as I just said in the previous, to the previous question, what fossil fuels represents is a store of carbon that's been locked out of the active cycle that operates around us all the time, that we operate ourselves when we eat food and then breathe out and so on. We're part of that. But that's a land, atmosphere, ocean cycle. We're taking new carbon at an enormous rate from a geological point of view, oxidizing it and shoving it into that system. So in principle, geosequestration is what you want to do. You want to immobilize that CO2 and shove it back down. Two issues with that. One, feasibility. Can you actually do that? And can you store it for millions of years where it is safe from the atmosphere? And two, the cost. And from what I'm starting to see is no one's cracked that cost problem yet. It's still very costly, particularly now that renewable costs are coming way down. Roger may want to add a little bit to that.
I think, as I said earlier, it's certainly not an option you would want to discard, and particularly if you're in Australia's position with a rich fossil fuel resource base and quite a strong legacy platform of fossil fuel power. Price is critical. I'm a bit more sanguine about the long-term storage possibilities. Yes, there will be some leaks somewhere, but they will balance. They won't all happen at once. However, you also have to remember that true geosequestration probably only going to deal with 10 to 11% of emissions. So it's part of the answer. Particularly if we can drive down the costs at the capture end, and that will only happen by doing it, trying it, and working down the cost curve. So it's not the answer to a maiden's prayer, but it is potentially part of the solution.
I do want to hear you expound on the answer to a maiden's prayer, perhaps at a cup of tea time. Roger, we've got, this gentleman here, and then up there, and then this woman who's been waiting almost the entire time. Thank you.
Nick Schofield, 99% of energy produced in Australia is from fossil fuels, of which we export almost 2/3 to other countries. Of the remainder that we use here, 96% is from fossil fuels and some 4.3% from renewables. That 4.3% figure has actually been declining over the last decade, and going back to 1960 was at 14%. When do you think we're going to see some real change in the energy sector in Australia?
I don't think those figures are quite right, and our website has better figures, and Will may, or one of you may recall what they actually are, at least for the domestic side of things. But just to give you an example of how quickly things are changing, I think it was in 2005, wind was just a couple of percent of South Australia's energy mix. Last year it was 26% of South Australia's energy mix. Solar is still a small percentage here, but growing. And you're right that the overall percentage of renewables hasn't been increasing as much as it may have otherwise, in part because there's less rainfall over the catchments and less hydropower than we were getting previously. But there is no doubt that the percentage of renewables is wind and solar is growing. And those sectors are growing quite quickly. Who knows how long it's going to take to make the transition, but the one thing I can say is that, you know, both sides of politics support the mandated renewable energy target of 20% renewable energy by 2020. So I think there's quite a lot of hope that we'll see that target achieved.
The number of houses that now have solar from 2006 went up from about 900 to, I think you quoted a number of about 1 million houses right now. So I mean, certainly if you look at these numbers, whether it's percentage increase or houses or what have you, there's certainly enough evidence to show that that has increased steadily over this period of time, which certainly means that it accounts for a greater proportion, increasing proportion of renewables in Australia.
Okay, now just to give you a bit of a heads up, we've only got about 4 or 5 minutes left for questions, so I'm aware there are a lot of people who still want to ask them. We're going to go through as quickly as we can. Yes?
Yes. Hi there, my name's Tom Swan. I'm a student at the ANU. I'm actually about to start a research project on unburnable carbon, so I was very excited to see a very quick reference to this in the back of this recent report. The idea of unburnable carbon, or the carbon bubble, is that we're over-investing in fossil fuels, and that means that investors in fossil fuels are going to end up losing a lot of money if we do meet the 2-degree guardrail. Just wanted your reflections on that and what can be done to mitigate this financial risk.
Well, that's a judgment that investors will have to make, as I said, as they're looking at new investments. There will be fossil fuels burned for quite some time because of the large legacy of power plants. When I spoke in Beijing last year as part of an advisory committee to the Premier, I made the point very strongly that they should be looking at the investments that they are making now, because they may not have the economic life span that they thought, unless they begin to dial in that China is expecting to turn its emissions south, to reduce them, to peak them and reduce them from the mid-2020s. So you have to think very carefully. So it's going to come back to company directors and investors making very careful judgments about what they invest in.
And if, of course, a lot of these new technologies come on board, whether it's about energy generation or industrial processes, then the fact that you can start to look at economic benefits in the long run means it's going to become a no-brainer. I mean, why won't you invest in new technologies down the road if they're going to give you actually cost benefits along the way? So I think a lot of that decisions are going to be based on achieving both environmental wins, but also economic benefits that you could potentially get on with.
Thanks, Veena. Now, up there is someone who's being pointed at by a whole bunch of people. You, sir. Thank you.
Robert Richardson, farmer, yes. It seems to me that the issue of baseload 24/7 power is still the major question in my mind. We talked earlier about the long length of time to develop the technological capabilities that we need for new technologies. How does the Commission think that Australia in the next 37 years is going to be able to develop the baseload 24/7 power generation that we're going to need without using fossil fuels?
I think that this baseload issue is one that is being honestly less and less important as time goes on, because if you have a very diverse series of inputs, including biogas and whatever else, and a large grid, and we have a very large grid here in southeastern Australia, and you have some sort of demand management and you have real-time costing. The experts in some of the big companies are saying you should be able to manage very, very high levels of renewable energy in your grid. And when you look at 37 to 40 years, boy, oh boy, I just look at what's happened in the last 5 years. You know, solar panels declining in cost 75%, cost of production 75%. Things are going to change dramatically over 37 years. At least in the professional discussions that I'm involved with some of the big companies, Tata Power, Siemens and so forth, this issue is a receding one as people realise that there are other ways around it. There are other ways to balance demand and generation.
I think we'll just leave that answer there because we do want to get through another couple of questions. Yes, thank you.
Hi,
Yeah, Barbara Norman, I'm Chair of the ACT Climate Change Council, so welcome to Canberra. My question's really at the practical level about implementation and possibly about the need to look at new governance mechanisms. So in the ACT, we have the ACT and we're surrounded by 17 local councils. So when we come to issues like renewable energy, wind farms, solar farms, new public transport systems, an integrated public transport system for heaven, if we ever achieve that. Are there any examples you're seeing in your 19 meetings that you can share with us where a region's really got its act together in a coordinated, collaborative way?
So a nice easy question to wrap things up with. Has anyone come across the Magic 10?
My short answer, Barbara, is no, which gives a great opportunity for the ACT in the southeast New South Wales region, the ACR, to really show the way. They're great examples and they're pieces of it, but I think, you've obviously hit upon an important point, is that a lot more can be gained by acting across jurisdictions and so on, particularly at the local or regional level. Huge opportunities there.
Okay, quick, yes?
Christian Colding, economist. Thank you to everyone else in the audience for helping me point me out. Given that climate change is a global problem and that everyone has a right to emit the same levels of carbon, what would be the effect if the average person in Asia, Africa and South America emits the same levels as targeted by Australia in the future? If it is to break the 2-degree target, does that imply that for some reason we get to emit more than other people around the world?
Thank you. The Justice.
Well, this is an issue that's been debated at length globally. It's essentially a burden-sharing issue. If you look at contraction and convergence, as it's called, you'd expect over time that we would all move towards a equivalent per person budget in the very long run. Now, this may not mean that in individual countries that there is a precise equivalence to that budget or among individuals within the country. But if you want to emit more, you'll be paying someone else to entitle you to do that. But this will only happen in the long run. It will only happen after a global agreement. And to get to a global agreement, we've all got to think about the short to medium term and act and build confidence in both the commitment of countries and in the technologies that we can see developing.
Thanks, Roger. Yes?
Michael Czar, the image of that northern corroboree frog that we will probably become extinct is pretty massive. But we don't eat that frog. So my question is, when are we going to lose the potato or the chicken or the cattle? So in terms of the food security question, bring it home to me as an individual and us as families.
Thanks, Michael.
Well, I'll try and answer it at a global level. Chickens don't produce methane, for example, so chickens are actually better than red meat, but that's an aside. Most of the modelling that I've seen indicates that at the higher latitudes, so think Greenland at the moment, food production will increase because cold actually limits plant growth. As you move closer and closer towards the equator, especially in regions that are set to continue to dry, such as sub-Saharan Africa and a lot of parts of Asia, especially if things like the Indian monsoon don't happen anymore, that's the regions, the temperate to tropical, subtropical regions, is where food security becomes a really big problem. There's lots of different modelling done on the major food crops of the world, but if we take the big three, wheat, rice and corn, up to about 30 or so degrees, the yield increases, and up after about 30 or 32 degrees, the yield declines. And depending on what emission scenario you look at and what crop in what region, most of the modelling I've seen indicates reductions in yield by somewhere between 5 and 15% of those big three by mid-century. So as Senator Heffernan raised before, that there's a double whammy problem because we may have a couple more billion people around by then. So clearly we're going to have to get a lot smarter and a lot more efficient about producing food, but possibly producing different sorts of food in different places. And as I said before, eating a lot less meat.
We are just pushing the timeline here. We did start a few minutes late, so I'm going to take that and give it to two of the people who are going to be around for the longest to live through this. So, yes?
I'm Gemma Williams. I'm from the Fenner School at the ANU. We've been talking about sustainable development for more than 25 years, which is longer than my lifetime. Given the data that you're presenting, should we now be talking about sustainable retreat, or to ask my question in a different way, is working towards climate resilience at odds with the notions of sustainable development?
And I can guarantee she is young because she's written a question on her phone, not paper.
That's right.
Yes?
Look, I think solving and dealing with the climate change issue is indeed part of a broader issue of sustainability on the planet. One of the areas I work in is in this area of the Anthropocene, the new geological epoch that's been driven by human activities. Climate change is one of the key aspects of that, but so is biodiversity loss, so is too much nitrogen and phosphorus going through the system, and so on. So there's a real issue of how we try to bring ourselves back within the Holocene, the present geological epoch, if I can put it that way. It's tricky stuff. But climate change, the three big issues there: climate change, biodiversity, the other ones feed into that. And on the human side, probably the biggest issue is an equity one. And that was just referred to by Roger in the previous question, of having these huge disparities in wealth. But there's a lot of research now on those areas of bringing the climate change issue into a broader framework of sustainability. Will we get there? Who knows? I think we're still in the balance.
And our final question, thank you.
Hello, I'm Isabel Hawes and I'm 14. I'm like, aside from joining youth or community forums, what do you believe should be done at the individual level? I'm particularly interested in what teenagers can do.
I can guarantee she's a teenager because she said 4 times. But I love that you asked a question.
Maybe.
Yep.
Yeah. Look, let me just give you an example of, we've been travelling all around the country in the last couple of years, and I think one of the most heartening things that we've done is to go to a couple of schools, one in Queensland and one in Melbourne, who have absolutely embraced the whole concept of sustainability and decreasing their carbon footprints. And one is Melbourne Grammar in Melbourne, obviously, Girls Grammar, and John Paul College outside Brisbane. And I'll never forget the principal of John Paul College saying, we are going to change the world one school at a time. So I think at the age of 14, one of the things that you can do is actually work with your school. These schools were doing absolutely extraordinary things. You know, they were practically carbon neutral, they had education programs, they were growing food, they were regenerating bushland, they had stationary bikes in the classrooms to generate power, they were doing just amazing things, you know, burning off lots of energy of teenagers, which is also a good thing. I think, you know, if you're 14, work with the kids in your high school and focus on that.
And I can certainly pitch in my favourite all-time activity is around looking at possibilities of setting up new recycling programs within the school. You know, I mean, we take it for granted now, but, you know, aluminum cans and so on that, you know, people sort of almost know has got an immense value in it. And so that's clearly something that's recycled. But there are a whole range of other products and things. And once you set that drive, whether it's your simple sort of glass bottles to plastic containers and so on, because remember, each of these products, it costs energy to produce. So the more of these systems you keep putting back into the loop, and the more each school
Vina,
does.
it's the last question. Wrap it up.
So set up a great recycling program in the school if you can do that.
And Tim.
The AYCC, great group. They have this amazing thing called Power Shift, where they get all their friends to shop at the one shop and get the bloke who owns the shop, whoever it is, to put those savings into energy-saving measures. So people love to shop, teenagers particularly like to get together, great social activity. And Amanda Mackenzie here is the person to speak to, I'm sure, if you want to get some more information.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our commissioners. And I'd like to ask Tim to come and do a bit of a final wrap-up. But before he gets his way over here, thank you so much to all the people who asked the questions, who kept them concise, who made them questions. And my apologies that it wasn't in exact order. It's very hard to keep control of everything here. But please, Tim, come and give us a wrap-up. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bernie, for doing such a great job. And thank you all for your questions. I think it's fair to say we've had a few questions that have tested the commissioners tonight, and we don't always get that at these community forums. But I really want to thank you most of all for your graciousness. No one asked us what we were going to do after September 14, and that is a marvellous relief not to have to answer that question. But thanks for coming. Please join us for a cup of tea after we wrap up here. And could we thank our commissioners? I think they've done a great job.
Thanks, Tim. And just a final reminder, it would be terrific if you could fill out your feedback form with those gift pens, and there'll be people collecting them as you make your way out to your cup of tea and chat time with the commissioners. Otherwise, you can leave them where you registered as well. Don't forget to go to the Climate Commission website, climatecommission.gov.au, for the infographics, for the video vignettes explaining all of this material, for anything you would want to know on that. And AYCC, Australian Youth Climate Coalition, that was spelt out before, plenty of organisations like that around. Thanks very much again, and we'll see you outside for a cup of tea. Cheers, have a good evening.